books are a lot different nowadays, aren't they? We've become too used to high fantasy, urban fantasy, and portal fantasy categories, or just the giant fantasy and sci-fi genre that bookstores normally put us in. But it seems with many books saturating the market, this just won't do. Could tropes and aesthetics be replacing genres in the book world? Well, if they are, we better make plans for it. My name is Amy Rosenfeld, and today we're making fantasy books so aesthetic. Tumblr, and later, Instagram and TikTok have been hubs for aestheticism. This movement has turned pop culture to a general sphere of what the majority of people are interested in to different bubbles, you would call it. A sphere of what is popular with different branches of types of people, and they are most notably represented in visual forms. This has now applied to books as a way to distinguish one type of book from another, more so than just a genre. And fantasy would be the one that has seen the broadest array of aesthetics to date. This video isn't necessarily a fantasy genre umbrella video, because arguably this goes even more specific and can span across genres too. This video instead explains some of the more common aesthetics and details the phenomena with fantasy marketing. And I fully expect to make another video on this because every year a new aesthetic of fantasy ends up getting popular at least once. Who knows, maybe this video will popularize the aesthetic of my own novel, ASTER'S CODA. Secret agent fantasy, spy fantasy. There's gotta be a better name for it than that. We're gonna start this off with the freshest aesthetic that has been popularized in this branch, and that is cozy fantasy. Cozy fantasy is best described as contemporary level problems but within a fantasy world. This has also been referred to by the common phrase Hallmark fantasy, a Hallmark movie in a fantasy setting. Fantasy without the destructive, world-destroying, universe-changing problems. Nobody will die and no monster is going to attack anybody. This aesthetic became popular from the novel Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, in which a half-orc retires from her life as a mercenary to start a coffee shop. Another one that has been rising in popularity but hasn't had a popular, solid name from my spheres lately is tech fantasy. This is an aesthetic where fantasy combines with the technological side of sci-fi. Arguably, ASTER'S CODA can be a part of this. Books with this genre, people often cannot categorize between fantasy and sci-fi. Why not just refer to it as both? It makes sense for these kinds of books to have their own label. Iron Widow by Shiren J. Zhao is one such tech fantasy book in which mech suits are powered by someone's inner chi, and they do this to fight off aliens. Never has a book sounded more anime, and I bet a lot of anime would fall into the tech fantasy category too. This next one has been popular for a while, and you might have heard of this one, Dark Academia. It is not an aesthetic that is exclusive to fantasy, and not exclusive to books either, but with the popularity of magic school books, Dark Academia of course had to make its way in there. Dark Academia is an aesthetic that is described as the romanticism of learning, but within the fantasy world it often describes corruption when pursuing knowledge. It stems from that to the visual look of old libraries, brown wool skirts and blazers and knitwear, glasses, classic bound books in stacks as you carry them across a campus. The aestheticism of studying with dark undertones. The most famous Dark Academia book with fantasy elements woven into it would likely be The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This is where a group of students of varying ages who are trained in the magical arts are selected to be part of a secret society. And things get even darker as the book goes on, where only 5 of them can keep this place. Dark Academia is also often confused with Gothic fantasy. Gothic relates to mystery and darkness popularized between the 12th and 16th centuries in Western European countries. Such styles were famed through Dracula. Think your classic vampires, ghosts, old castles. While it relates to this time period, it doesn't necessarily have to be from that time period. It could be in the modern day, but most of the story just takes place in a Gothic home or castle. And the stuff they have to fight is very Gothic monsters or a bunch of ghosts like your typical haunted house. Belladonna by Adeline Grace is one novel that is described as Gothic, with apothecaries, death, ghosts present throughout this novel. Mythos fantasy is a fantasy that is inspired by myths and legends of other cultures. And because of homogeny and popularity, it is most often Greek and Roman. These can include retellings of myths, or a book that takes place in a world that is similar to these ancient periods. This explicitly relates to the mythos and not the country. As we all know, the epitome of this trend is Percy Jackson, but other books exist that isn't just mythology in a modern city. Song of Achilles, for example, takes the story of Achilles and turns it into a sappy gay tragedy. Cottagecore fantasy is a fantasy story that idealizes living in a cottage in the woods or the fields, and the cottage is like tiny, made of stone, covered in ivy. The aestheticism of rural living without the copious amounts of mud. Tiny fairies, woodland-based witches, and plant-based magics are often found in a cottagecore fantasy. An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Robinson comes as a highly recommended cottagecore fantasy romance from my flatmate. It's got fairies and an autumnal flair, which is unusual because cottagecore is often seen as spring aesthetics, but other aesthetics like summer, winter, and autumn can still be part of cottagecore. Fantasy of Manners is if Jane Austen novels were fantasy. Regency period courting and family dramas, but with just a touch of magic to help the maidens choose their suitors. What kind of magic? That's up to you, but it is there to add flavor to the courtship, to Mr. Darcy and Lizzie Bennet, and to all the balls, dinners, and tea parties that had happened during the period. Shades of Milk and Honey by Mary Robinette Kowal is often compared to Jane Austen novels being magical. The magic in this novel is maidens using glamour to be able to gain a husband. Dungeons & Dragons inspired fantasy has become its own aesthetic in my eyes. But that's just because I can tell when novels are inspired by this kind of stuff. It has the dragons, the quests, the found family, and the archetypes that are typically found inside of a D&D party. Someone heals, someone sneaks, someone has magic, someone is a good weapon hitter. It plays out a bunch of tropes that we are familiar with in Dungeons & Dragons and puts it into a book format. I'm not gonna say the obvious and pull out one of Critical Role's books because I don't even think those books have parties in them. However, the Dragon Lord series does by John Hollins. I cannot stop gushing about this book. I think it's my second personality trait after hating on City of Bones. You get a party with different kinds of people with their D&D equivalent archetypes, and they go and steal from a friggin' dragon's horde in order to survive. Hell yes. Dystopian fantasy is exactly what it sounds like. In our world, and it's some kind of near future, and magic is involved in some form to create the dystopia. It links to the reason that it is a dystopia in the first place. Either the people who have magic are in power, or the people who are being discriminated against in this dystopia have magic. And my favorite part of it? Magic and tech! I love magic and tech. The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon is a series that epitomizes dystopian fantasy. Heard of her? She wrote Priory of the Orange Tree, but this was the series she wrote before Priory. Clairvoyants who speak, communicate, and gain powers from the dead end up being the enemies of the dystopian government. They are deemed illegal in many factions of this world, but everyone else is still put under pretty heavy rules as a result, to try and protect them. Hero fantasy has been on the rise since Batman and Marvel movies got put onto the silver screen, so you're bound to see them in book form too. These are basically fantasy books where superhero type shit's common. I rarely see superhero stuff placed in fantasy personally, but it could also be because I don't look out for them that much. Our exhibit is Dreadnought by April Daniels, in which a trans girl gains superpowers, and she has to deal with the consequences of gaining powers as well as her transition that the powers enabled in her. Oh, and fighting bad guys and a super team and all that good stereotypical stuff. Wow, I listed 10 aesthetics and I didn't even count them when I was writing the script. I'm probably gonna make more of these because the fantasy subgenres are getting quite specific now. Do you want me to do more? Let me know in the comments and let me know if there's any aesthetics that you think I've missed out. If you did enjoy this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you are new around here. You can ring that bell to find out when I post more creative content. You like spy fantasy? Check out ASTER'S CODA exposure. Follow Abby Tacker as she learns about the three worlds and her place in it in the midst of an otherworldly blood feud as she gets recruited to the Sub Rosa. And while you're down in the description, head to my website to sign up for my newsletter and also check me out on Instagram and TikTok. Stay creative everybody, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.